Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Astromapping. And this episode is super special because we're doing a showcase with our first graduates from the AstroMapping Certificate program. And let me tell you, they are all amazing. We're going to be talking about Amanda Knox. In case you haven't heard of Amanda Knox, she's a young American lady at the time in 2007. She was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, and she decided to move to Italy as an exchange student. And she had a very horrible experience there. I can't imagine what she went through, but she's a very stoic and beautiful young lady. She was crucified by the media and portrayed as a wild, manipulative, bizarre type of monster. And she was pressured or actually even kind of tricked into admitting guilt. And it was discovered later on, thank God she had a wonderful family that stood up for her, but the evidence also stood up for her too. It was discovered later on that the police tainted the crime scene and it resulted in false DNA evidence. This is Amanda Knox, the lovely lady you see in the photo here. And this is her on a recent photo in March 2025 in Good Morning America, speaking about her memoir, Free, reflecting on the transformation and public narrative. And you can find us via ABC News, Good Morning America. She was convicted and exonerated not once, but twice for murder, a murder she did not commit. She was harshly judged without consideration of her age, her maturity, her experience of trauma. And let's keep in mind, people, that she was an American girl in a foreign country, and she was still learning Italian. So it was kind of tough with her when she was trying to do the interviews and, answer the interrogation during the police interviews and interrogation. While she was jailed as part of the police tactic, she was actually falsely told that she had HIV. And with that, it totally discombobulated her. And she was thinking, when did this happen? How did this, who? And she started writing down in her diary about the men that she was with. And this personal diary was stolen from her. And it was given to a journalist named Nick Pisa. He's from England. And it was revealing her sexual history. And it was so taken out of context. Imagine these were like, she's a young lady, and these are her personal, intimate connections with these different men and how it was exploited. And she had this Italian boyfriend during the time of the murder, and they filmed her kissing him and hugging him. She was just looking for consolation. And they were like, look at this wild sex fiend. She looks like an angel, but she's really a devil. And it was really tough. She spent 4 years, people, in an Italian prison for a crime that she did not commit. She was convicted twice, exonerated twice. And once she got out, she had become an advocate for those wrongly accused. She's an author, a speaker, and a magnificent woman. And for all you women out there that are listening, all you men, or what you identify with, this is a human being that we should look up to because she has transcended her hardships and her toil. Amanda says, I didn't depend on myself much, and I felt like it was very important for me to get out of my comfort zone and see if that could turn me into an adult. Oh, I think this turned her into more of an adult, all right. We are going to start with our first analysis, our first student. I want to introduce you to Meg. Meg started off, I remember all of these students, as a matter of fact, and it's really nice to see how all of you have grown and evolved and just the beautiful maturation and the blossoming. And Meg is one of those students. Meg is an Aquarius with a Pisces moon and an Aries rising. And she's originally born in South Africa. So imagine having to contend with Southern Hemisphere astrology. And she now lives in the Northern Hemisphere in Ireland. She was very masterful with integrating into her own life. She's lived in 15 cities, over 5 different countries. She's traveled to over 21 countries around the world. She is now certified in astromapping through Kepler College. Woo, woo. And she is a student at the Faculty of Astrological Studies in the UK. If you'd like to get in touch with Meg, she could be found at www.theexpatastrologer.com, and we will have her socials posted in the links below. Meg, please say hello and feel free to start with your presentation, your analysis.
Hi, thank you so much, Cindy. We've each been tasked with different questions on topics related to Amanda Knox and the case of Amanda Knox. So just for me, when you dive into astromapping, it's very easy to look straight to the map and look at all those planetary lines, but I'm taking it back to the natal chart first. So we'll look at the natal chart first and discover sort of what we're actually looking at when we dive into astrocartography as well. I'm also going to look at the changes that were made or occurred when she moved to Italy. Her relocated chart came into effect. And then the main theme that I'm kind of conscious about answering in this discussion is, how did Italians view Amanda? And so we'll look at some of the lines that are activated in Perugia, Italy, and the relocated chart, and then the perceptions that Italians might have had before and after the trial of Amanda Knox. And then last thing is, I'm going to dive into remote activation. This is a technique that I learned right in the beginner astromapping course with Cindy, and remote activation definitely played a role in the trial and in the coverage of this trial, and we'll look to see the effects that might have had on her. Just before I start again, I just want to say it's my own personal viewpoint. I haven't spoken to Amanda personally, so I can't confirm anything that I'm seeing. Obviously, as astrologers, we look at the natal chart with an unbiased, but there is obviously some sort of things that I can't validate for sure without asking her herself. I want to be kind of respectful of all the different parties that were involved in this case. Somebody died. Amanda Knox's life was definitely changed for tragedy and heartbreak and a sense of loss as well. And as a person who's living in a foreign country, I feel that quite deeply. Never mind the fact that she was a young child that happened to her, I feel quite personal about it. Okay, so first of all, I'm looking at her natal chart. I should also say that I'm using equal house system. Obviously, different house systems will portray the planets in different houses. So I'm using equal house. And obviously, we don't have enough time to fully look at her whole entire natal chart. I'm just picking out a few things. The big thing that I see that's quite prominent in her chart is the seesaw chart shape that's being formed between the first house and the seventh house. She has so many planets in her first house, which is linked to her identity and her sense of self. And then the seventh house, which represents relationships. And so there's this push-pull between her identity of herself and her identity in the relationships that she has with other people. She is a Gemini rising and with a Mercury in Scorpio ruling her chart in her first house. I feel like she definitely has this energy of learning by doing. So this experiencing life, kind of going out and seeking it, definitely with the Sagittarius descendant and being attracted to maybe foreign lands, and the interest of going to a foreign country was definitely sparked. You know, she wanted to go and experience life, and so going to a foreign country was where she felt most like being, you know, honoring herself and honoring her truth. She also has Chiron and Vesta in Gemini in her first house. So a passion for languages, but also learning to speak her truth. It's really quite sad that she had to go through this absolutely awful tragedy to almost find her voice, and sharing that message becomes almost like healing a wound for her. When we look at the seventh house, Saturn is very close to her descendant, but it's also very close to her moon. And her moon, Uranus, and Ceres are all out of bounds. We learn that in sort of high declinations, when planets are out of bounds, they don't necessarily always behave in the same way that we would ordinarily imagine them to behave. And so that's kind of important to know, because how she's perceived by others might not necessarily be how she is actually as a person. So we have these perceptions of people seeing her as being super self-confident, but maybe she's not. I think also this experience that happened to her in Italy, she was a kid, right? She's still figuring things out. And I think, you know, there was a part of her chart that kind of says that she might have been masking herself as a way of self-protecting herself. So perceiving like she knew what she was doing, but actually freaking out behind the scenes. I could go into lots more information about her natal chart, but we don't have time for that. Also just zoomed in on her birth location, which I know Brandi's going to dive into more detail, but I just highlighted the planetary energy of the energy that she was born with. So she has a moon Pluto setting or descendant crossing, and I've bolded these lines just so we can see them, so that has just slightly changed to what you might necessarily see when you're looking at astrocartography maps. She mentions that she's keen to travel to Italy to kind of have a chance to become an adult and grow and do things herself. That building pressure she might have experienced with that Pluto and moon, maybe a young adult with a protective family upbringing, so kind of wanting to move away from that. So in Ariel's class, we learned about sort of looking at the day-night shading of the overall map. So you can see that where she lived in Seattle, that Pluto moon crossing is in the shaded area because the sun was still rising in the east and hadn't fully lit up that part of the world. And whereas in Europe, it was daylight hours. And so it's important to note that that's kind of like how we can see the changes occurring in her move to Italy. So I do think the decision for her to move to Italy might have seemed quite naive, or maybe a bold search for freedom. And maybe she was also just kind of wanting to do things on her own terms. She does have a North Node in Aries, very much a pioneer and a warrior. Having the courage to be independent of others is kind of her purpose. And she's kind of trying to do things differently and do it her way. There's a major theme of her wanting freedom. I think I've talked about that with that Sagittarius in the 7th house. The next slide shows you the differences and changes between her natal chart and her relocated chart. So you can see that seesaw shape that was previously in her 1st and 7th house has now moved in her relocated chart up to sort of showing very prominently in the 9th and 10th house, and then the 3rd and the 4th house is activated as well. I think it's very interesting that her relocated chart has her as a Virgo rising, which again is ruled by Mercury. Although we don't leave the natal chart when we move to another country, it's just kind of interesting to see what's getting activated, what's moving to an angle that previously wasn't at an angle, and what's changing in the natal chart. The natal chart is always the promise, right? It's the one we keep, but the relocated chart adds a different layer. So we're looking at those different themes that could have been kind of changing. And we're seeing how here maybe the focus that, sort of Italians might have viewed her, as like, sort of being quite public and outward and focused, instead of those personal planets that were previously in the 1st house. They're now kind of right there for everyone to see. And then in the next slide, I show the planetary lines that are being activated. So she has that moon IC, which is that sense of emotional connection, sense of belonging here, but her moon is out of bounds, and so may have felt that attachment slightly differently. She's also got a lot of other lines that I know Laurie's diving into later, so I won't take up too much time there. But I just wanted to say that I think from the viewpoint that a lot of people would have said when she started out, she was definitely maybe seen as an outsider. That Uranus IC line is definitely showing up in terms of, quirky, fun, American foreign student coming to learn a new language and be doing something different. Most Italians would have just brushed that off as like slightly different to sort of everyone else. And then when she had that murder trial, the murder occurred and murder trial started, and she was wrongly accused, all of these themes of being different to others basically turned on her. Suddenly she's viewed with disgust, seen as deceitful, rebellious, erratic, emotional, being guilty. And that would have been very difficult for her to kind of plead her innocence. The Italians really got quite swept away with the media coverage, and it's so easy to blame an outsider than somebody that was, local to them. And then in my last slide, I just want to look at the remote activation. So here we can see running right close by to the UK is that lovely Saturn IC line. And that really kind of brings even more trouble for her. It's interesting because the roommate that was murdered was British. And so it would be kind of interesting to know how that relationship would have carried on had she lived. But definitely British headline UK tabloids, they definitely took the side of the British student. versus the guilty American. They had these awful headlines that you can see that I screen grabbed. The UK headlines were really focusing on this persecution, isolating, their fears coming to life. And this is all very Saturnian themes. I also thought it was kind of interesting that she was labeled the Ice Queen, Ice Maiden, cold and calculating. And these are all very much Saturnian themes as well. The effect of that remote activation for Amanda was likely that they did try to ice her out. They isolated her. She was greatly misunderstood by British tabloids. She was made to be seen as guilty and perhaps even like the victim of cruel forms of punishment and persecution just by tarnishing her name. And that definitely does feel like Saturn IC taking effect in the remote activation. And that is the end of my slides.
I like that you really pointed this out about the Saturn line, and let us remember that Saturn represents death. And it almost quite literally played out there. And it's her IC. It's almost like she was buried by death in some ways, not just the victim, Meredith Kircher, but Amanda was too. You were right in that she was just a kid, and she would say the same thing too. As a matter of fact, she said something along the lines that she was just a kid who needed her mother. Because when we're 18, we're officially adults, but we're really still babies to the world. And she did go to Italy with her family when she was a kid, and she enjoyed it. And that was her connection to the familiarity to go back. Now, given that she is a sun sign Cancer, even though she was very adventurous, she's still a Cancer. So you could see that. And you could also connect it with her words of mother and the theme of going somewhere familiar that was tied in with family. Thank you, Meg, for mentioning that the natal chart is the key that we always look at. So you don't just jump to the maps like you mentioned that, which is exactly the way to do it. You look at the natal and see what the natal promise, what is the potential of that person? And then you looked at the lens of how Italy or Italians would view her through that lens, and that relocation was a hint of that. Why? Because when we move, our DNA does not change, but our points of view of the sky, as does the lens. Meg, fantastic presentation. I love how you analyzed it and how you went deep into it. And I love that you went into equal houses. Do you have anything else that you wanted to share or anything else that you wanted to say?
Oh, it's a fascinating case, and I hope that I portrayed what I thought was important to share about her chart and this trial.
And thank you, too, for mentioning that you didn't speak directly with her. This is strictly analysis based on what you've learned and what you've gleaned from what is out there in public. None of us have spoken with Amanda, but Amanda, we just want to let you know that all of us here were listening and watching your stories and like, whoa. Amanda said, I think people love monsters. So when they get the chance, they want to see them. It's people projecting their fears. They want reassurance and they know who the bad people are, and it's not them. With that, I'd love to introduce Brandi. She is a certified professional astrologer, and she is also one of our first 5 graduates. Woo, woo. Brandi says, you're not just choosing a place to go, you're choosing a version of yourself to meet there. How profound and poetic. If you'd like to get in touch with Brandi, she could be reached at www.tigerEyeOracle.com. Brandi, take it from here.
Thank you, Cindy. Today, I'm going to walk everyone through a quick snapshot of what I see when I look at Amanda's natal chart that's like really relevant to her Italy experience. I'm going to look at the astrocartography lines near her birthplace, and I'm also going to talk a little astronomy, then look at the planetary lines she experienced in Italy. I'm also going to talk about who she was and who she became once she returned home, including her advocacy work. Okay, so looking at Amanda's natal chart, this is Amanda's chart in Placidus. Amanda is a Cancer sun, Sagittarius moon, Gemini rising, but her chart is very heavy in cardinal fire energy, which equals Aries. So Aries is her chart signature. It rules the 12th house, and Jupiter is in the 12th house. So I say all that to say that 12th house topics are a major part of her life. And 12th house is, jails, institutions, hospitals, fears. And at this point in the presentation, we all know that her time in jail in Italy has really continued to shape her life, even though that conviction was finally overturned and the case was closed in 2015. Jupiter in Aries in the 12th house expands and agitates this. And I want you guys to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the slides. Amanda, she was born in Seattle, Washington. She was born in close orb, less than 2 degrees from her Pluto and Moon descendant line. Okay, so now looking at her chart along with the map, we see that the Moon is above the horizon and that Pluto is below the horizon. These planets are averse to each other. They're not communicating with each other according to the birth chart. Also, she's a Cancer sun ruled by the Moon, making her Moon strong in her chart. Now, when we look at this planetary ascension, we can see like where the planets are actually rising and setting. The birth chart is 2D, and this is a 3D representation. And I'll show that to you guys close up on the next slide. All right, so this is the planetary ascension close up. You can see the horizon right there represented by the red line. Purple is Pluto and light gray is the Moon, and they're both setting. And Pluto is much closer to the horizon than you would think just by looking at her birth chart. So her Moon and Pluto do actually communicate in this way. Now, planetary ascension is a topic that we learned and discussed in astronomy for AstroMapping, which is part of the AstroMapping Certificate. And it really drove home the point for me that although the birth chart is very valid, you can also get more information and delineate more nuance when you look at the actual 3D location of the planets. Another factor adding to Pluto's strength is visibility. Pluto was visible in the night sky when Amanda was born. So now knowing that Pluto is actually closer to the descendant, a sensitive point in the chart that deals with relationships with others, Amanda's dealings with others is very likely to be raw and intense. When she went to Italy, she encountered her Uranus IC and she experienced disruption and chaos to her home and her personal life. And also she encountered her Chiron midheaven line, which really put her life and her situation on display for everyone to see. It was a real spectacle with the news coverage and the tabloids. When she was interrogated, she states that she was assaulted by the police. While she was in prison, someone actually sent her diary to the press, and the press really used that to paint her as promiscuous. Now, while all of that was happening, she actually used her time in jail to help other inmates write letters and communicate with their loved ones. She has said that she went to Italy for the experience and to find herself. And based on what she's doing now, based on her advocacy work, I would say that it appears that she has. So after she experienced everything that she experienced in Italy, the stress, the fear, the public humiliation, she came back home to her Pluto and Moon descendant crossing. She has also said, and I am paraphrasing when I say she said, I'm paraphrasing from her interviews and from the documentary. She has also said that she came back home a different person. Coming home to her Pluto and Moon descendant crossing, after everything she went through in Italy, she no longer aspired to just live a normal life. She mentioned that in an interview. Pluto Moon descendant line is going to affect how you interact and relate to others. Partnerships and connections become a site of transformation and deep psychological growth. This placement can bring an almost magnetic pull towards intense and all-consuming partnerships and connections. Now, for Amanda, this can mean that she attracts people and situations that challenge her, push her into self-discovery. Pluto can also indicate relationships that push a person to evolve and grow. And now adding to this dynamic is the moon. It will really bring out the desire to be protective, supportive, and the desire to make sure that everyone around you has what they need. So this energy, it seems to be present in her life since returning home. She did not disappear and live a private life. She has become an advocate for the wrongly convicted. She has spoke about her work with multiple organizations for the wrongfully convicted. I wanted to highlight the Great Northern Innocence Project because she mentioned them in a recent interview. And I encourage you to check out their website so you can learn more about how they help to fight for freedom for the innocent. Now, in this recent interview, she talked about really leaning into advocacy work and helping the wrongfully convicted. She works to increase transparency in the prison system, increase humanity in the prison system. She is doing the work to help transform the experience of prisoners from just punishing them to actually rehabilitating them. She said that she actually feels fortunate to be able to do something that matters. She shows a strong desire to create change and to help those wrongfully convicted gain their freedom, but also to tear down the elements of the legal system that are broken so that it can be rebuilt with more focus on rehabilitation. Now, to me, this really speaks to the Pluto moon descendant lines because she isn't just fighting for freedom, she's fighting for that transformation, for a justice system that doesn't just punish, but also works to heal. And in that fight, she's not waiting for change, she is part of that change. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope it spoke something meaningful, and I'll give it back to Cindy.
Brandi, wonderful presentation. If we could get back to the slide on the birth chart with the map. This points out a couple things to piggyback on what Meg did. She used equal houses. Brandi used Placidus houses. So that kind of goes to show you that which house system you use is down to your comfort zone. Brandi also brought up the astronomy of astromapping because you'll learn with Kepler College that the chart uses one coordinate system and the ACG maps use a different coordinate system. And you could see that within that chart on the left, Pluto does not look like it is anywhere near the descendant, yet there it is in the map right next to Earth, its actual position, so close to Seattle, Washington, where she was born. And they say in astrocartography, wherever you go, you take yourself with you. Her experiences in Italy, my oh my, were they intense? Didn't they sound rather Plutonian? And yes, of course, it amplified that Chiron and Uranus experience, but the Plutonian type of turmoil. And given the fact that she is a Cancer sun sign, and that moon is going to be very important in her chart, we could even say that she was within orb of that crossing, which is very fateful. And that crossing ended up playing in her life overseas. I did want to mention Brandi and to bring up about the other students here that despite have already having fulfilled all the requirements for the AstroMapping certificate, she continues to study and be a student. And she keeps on diving in. And that's what you're going to find once you're in Kepler College and doing this, because the universe is vast. It just doesn't end there. You're just going to want to keep on going. And just as displayed with her experiences, Amanda said, I wasn't the same person to come back to Seattle. I think that Pluto in her chart really did help play out in the shock and the experience and the turmoil of the Chiron and the Uranus. I'd like to introduce Beth Scannell. Beth is a graduate of Astrology University's astrologer training program, and she's also studied evolutionary astrology with Stephen Forrest. She is certified in astromapping with Kepler College, one of our first graduates. Woot, woot. And she is now pursuing a master's degree in cultural astronomy and astrology at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. Amazing. That's a lot to take on. She currently serves on the board of Astrology Toronto. Beth enjoys helping people navigate through significant life cycles, turning points, and tricky life passages. She offers astrology and tarot consultations, including astromapping, of course. She could be reached through her website, www.bethscannell.com. Beth, we'd like to hear what your analysis is.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. What I'm going to be talking about today is Amanda's most prominent astrocartography lines around her birthplace of Seattle. And then the natal signature, or what Cindy calls her geotag, that she'll carry with her in Italy or wherever she goes in the world. And this is going to show the influences that are going to be with her no matter what. I'm also going to talk about geodetics a little, her natal geodetics line in both Seattle and Perugia. And then I'll look at the transiting geodetic lines that were in effect during some of the most critical events that happened to her during her time in Italy. This is Amanda's astrocartography map for the area around Seattle. And you can see, as Brandi has also discussed, the closest line is the Pluto descendant. It's only 35 miles east of Seattle. Also, her moon descendant line is also close. It's just a little bit northwest. And then I'm also looking at the Mars IC line. And though it's a little bit farther to the west, it's really important. We're going to see in the following slides how important Mars is, both in her natal signature and also in the geodetics. This is Amanda's natal chart. This is in Kochhaus systems. So when it comes to her natal signature, her geotag, you can see that in the birth chart, Pluto's farther away from the descendant than you would have thought looking at the astrocartography map. And that's due to Pluto's incline and the right ascension. But this demonstrates why it's so important to look at both the natal chart and the astrocartography map if you want to get a full picture. So having the Pluto descendant line so close to her birthplace, she may have attracted others who wanted to control her or exert power over her in some way. And this was one of the most dominant energies that followed her to Italy and what she experienced there. With her moon descendant line close as well, she may also have tended to project her emotions onto others, or others may project emotions onto her, which I believe also was happening for her in Italy. If you look at her moon, it's at 21 degrees Sagittarius, and her moon's out of bounds. It's conjunct Uranus, which is also out of bounds. Stephen Forrest, some of the meanings that he gave to an out of bounds moon were breaking out of social constructs, sociopathy and criminal behavior, or alleged sociopathy and criminal behavior. So with this signature, Amanda was never likely to behave in a conventional way. With the out of bounds moon, there's often a pattern of going against social training and expectations, and especially when Uranus is also involved. And I was saying the third most prominent, the next closest line was the Mars IC. So natally, Amanda's Mars is in Leo, in her third house of a quadrant system. Somebody with Mars in Leo radiates confidence and boldness, may be seen and recognized as a strong and charismatic leader. And in the Netflix documentary, Amanda Knox, when Amanda was still at home and before she ever went to Italy, she said she thought of herself as quirky and ridiculous, but also as a warrior princess like Xena. And this is reflected both in the out of bounds moon conjunct Uranus and her Mars in Leo. And she was okay with that. She said she knew she was different, but she felt she was going to find her place in the world. But here you can see Mars is also in an out of sign conjunction to Black Moon Lilith in Cancer, which is also out of bounds. In Jewish folklore, Lilith appeared as a sexually insatiable, nocturnal demon who brings storms, diseases, and the death of babies. In modern astrology, Black Moon Lilith represents the outsider, the outcast, those who refuse to conform or submit to the dominant paradigm, and the woman who refuses to be subordinate to a man, even at the cost of rejection or unfair treatment. And it also represents those who protect the marginalized. So in out of bounds, Black Moon Lilith can feel very extreme. And this conjunction with Mars adds to the likelihood that she would be seen as a sexual criminal, as well as someone who could be guilty of violence. However, Amanda would also be called to speak about and fight for the wrongfully accused. People who follow the beat of their own drum are often considered deviant. Then there are those cases of crimes that are alleged but not proven, where the truth remains unclear. People with out-of-bounds placements are often implicated in these kinds of circumstances. In Amanda's case, the behavior she was accused of was alleged, but this was the kind of signature that under different circumstances she may have led her to commit the kinds of crimes she was accused of. So this tells us a little bit about her natal signature, her geotag, and what Amanda brought with her to Perugia. So this is an image of the geodetic reference map for the world. While astrocartography sets up a separate map for each individual chart, the geodetic map has permanent zodiacal and angles, so you can see where the planets of any chart fall on an angle anywhere in the world. Looking at your own geodetic map can show you how the world sees you and how others may see you in certain places. And it can also be used to help understand the mundane influences at work in a given location on a particular day. This is Amanda's geodetic lines near Seattle. Here we can see that Mars and Black Moon Lilith are also prominent in Amanda's natal geodetic map. The Mars descendant line is close to Seattle, only 45 miles, but the Black Moon Lilith descendant line is just 3 miles from Seattle, so it's especially strong. These mirror the Mars Black Moon Lilith conjunction in her natal chart, but with the geodetics, it indicates how others see her. They may be projecting the potential violence of Mars and the potential dark sexuality of Black Moon Lilith onto her. And these are Amanda's geodetic lines near Perugia. You can see that Mars is also very prominent for Amanda in Italy. Her geodetic Mars ascendant line runs right through the country and only 72 miles west of Perugia. One interpretation of Mars is violence, and in Italy she was seen as a violent criminal. She also has her geodetic North Node Midheaven line a little bit farther west of Perugia. This can indicate a place where experiences that shape your career or destiny can be experienced or triggered. Clearly, she attracted a great deal of attention here, and both locally and in the international media. But on this line, you can also feel called to serve something that's larger than yourself, like teaching or advocacy, for instance, something that helps you move forward on your life's path. And that was also part of something that Amanda took away with her advocacy for the wrongly accused and the material for the books she would come to write. The geodetic sun ascendant line is over 800 miles from Perugia, but the sun can sometimes have a wider orb. And coming to Italy did really light her up. It brought her lots of attention and greater visibility. So this tells us a little about Amanda's geodetic signature, adding to her natal astrocartography signature. Okay, so I wanted to look at some of the transiting geodetic lines over Italy on the days of some of Amanda's key events. On January 16th, 2009, Amanda's trial began. The geodetic Mars Jupiter descendant line passed over Perugia. Jupiter represents the law, judges, lawyers, and also foreign cultures and traveling to foreign lands. So this was the energy that was active in Perugia on that day. After being found guilty and sentenced to 26 years in prison, Amanda was cleared of charges on October 3rd, 2011. The transiting geodetic Mercury IC line passed over Perugia, with the Sun IC line following afterward. Mercury, which signifies speaking, was in Libra, which represents justice. So on that day, justice was spoken in Perugia. Mercury is also about movement. Amanda got to go home, her IC, where she said all she wanted was to be with her family. And the Sun IC line that followed indicated a joyful homecoming for her. Unfortunately, it was short-lived. On March 26, 2013, the geodetic Mars MC line passed over Italy and the retrial was ordered. This way, Amanda was seen publicly, her MC, her public image as a violent murderer, cycled back around and demanded to be seen and addressed again. She was declared guilty again, and the case was then appealed to the Italian Supreme Court. In March of 2015, the forensic evidence used in Amanda's case was found to be tainted, and it was declared invalid. The case was then dismissed for good. And on September 7th of that year, as the transiting geodetic Mercury IC line passed over Perugia again, the Italian Supreme Court published their report on Amanda's acquittal, finally putting an end to the case. So once again, Mercury was in Libra, and justice was written and communicated. So there's a little bit about how looking at the geodetics can add another layer of information to astromapping. And that's what I had to say. Thank you for letting me be part of this, and I will turn it back to Cindy.
Thank you, Beth. What a wonderful presentation. So, folks, you could see so far we have 3 different house systems for her natal chart analysis. Yet again, we get to see that it is using a different type of coordinate system, and it's the comfort of what we analyze. Yet you see how Beth integrated that Mars IC line with the Mars in her chart. One of the things Amanda mentioned when she was promoting her book in one of her interviews was that when she returned home after being exonerated, how her temper was on all the time when she returned, and she couldn't explain where this anger came from. And yet there we have it that Beth pointed out that Mars that was prominent in her chart, whether we think it was out of orb or not. You also see how deep that Beth went into the Black Moon Lilith and the Geodetics. She seamlessly blended the knowledge she learned from different astrology schools as well. And as an academic organization, Kepler College welcomes multiple points of view. Beth so poignantly shared how we can't just look at the map and say, oh, the line is out of orb. And we can't just look and say, well, this is what it is. She went deeper and she started bringing things to light with the analysis. Beth, thank you so much for showing those learning astromapping that we always have to look at the whole picture.
Thank you, Cindy.
I was getting to know the city. I was owning it. I had never been in love before. That's what Amanda said about her experience in Italy. Speaking of holistic, I'd like to introduce Shae. Shae Freeman is a Sun Scorpio, an Aquarius moon, and a Capricorn rising, an astrocartographer, an astrologer, an astroherbalist, and medical astrologer. She's also an artist, a symbologist. She does divination, and a Louisiana master naturalist, and a birder. So Shae is definitely a very wide variety person. And as a Scorpio, you can imagine the amount of depth she brings in. Shae Freeman describes herself as a healing practitioner. And she's recently certified in astrocartography through Kepler College. Whoop, whoop. And she works with local space astrology, feng shui, and energetic remediation to realign people with their place. With a background in the arts and multiple healing modalities, her work bridges energy, environment, and embodiment. Shae brings a deeply intuitive and practical approach to spatial remediation and energetic alignment. Welcome, Shae. We'd love to hear your analysis using local space.
Thank you for that introduction. So local space. I love local space. I try to utilize it a lot in my life. And like everyone else has presented here, it's yet another layer we can add on to view ourselves in our environment. So local space, I kind of feel like the phrase, wherever you go, there you are, totally applies to local space. I do have a quote, and I apologize because I do not know who said it or where I ran across it, but I loved it. Local space astrology is the power of place in the present moment, which I think is perfect. So what we're going to look at for Amanda is her local space from her natal location through Europe and Italy. And then once we get into Italy, we're going to kind of jump around. So we're going to do a little zoom out, zoom in, zoom out again. What I'm starting with here are her local space lines, which is that dial from the previous slide, where they run over Italy. What I'm highlighting here are her Mars, Neptune, and Mercury local space lines. I wouldn't weight these extremely strongly because we are talking about the local horizon from her birthplace. It will give you an idea of the flavors you can expect to encounter when you travel along those local space lines. So here we can see, and we will see, there are some repeated themes that sort of corroborate everything that everyone else has already discussed. So here we have Neptune dealing with those issues of confusion, deception. There's drug references in the media. There's projection and scapegoating, all of those kind of rather shadowed Neptunian themes, really. Venus also, because her romantic involvement played a key role in the public perception. And then, of course, we have that Mercury line, which is all about the way that people controlled the narrative, talked about her the way that she was and wasn't really her own view of herself. She also did a lot of interviews. The interrogation, especially without translator, also speaks to that Mercury experience there. There are also two crossings, and I just noted them on this slide, but I will circle around to them at the end. They're important, and just we'll keep those in mind, and I'll hit them again in a later slide. Wherever you go, you take that energetic blueprint with you. And what local space is looking at is where those lines are projecting out from your location. Wherever you are, you get to take it with you. So this is a view relocated to Perugia, the city center. And I like to start here, and this is the fun thing with local space, is you get to kind of move it around wherever you travel, like a long ways away, relocated to the city, and then to your actual home. So that's what we're going to look at. So from this, you can see that while it's not exactly over the house, that house that she chose to live in lies in the direction of her Saturn line in local space. And what did she say? I went to Italy to try to become an adult. And that's a Saturnian theme through and through. So I've just found that very fascinating to look at. And also, I'll tie that in later. Those Saturn moon lines play an important role with Meredith as well. So this is from her actual location, the actual address. And I wanted to put this slide up just to point out how much local space actually flavors our experiences and how they line up with important people or important places that we would travel to in our local environment. So I wanted to point out here the sun line in orange brought in two men that were important to her story, Raphael and Rudy. If we look at the purple line, I highlighted that because the university she was attending is actually on her Jupiter local space line. So we have that higher learning and knowledge. And then I highlighted her moon line because the court where she was tried is directly on her moon line. And I found this fascinating just because of the conviction in the overturning and the conviction in the overturning had this very phasic moon quality about it. So I think this really, the local space will really show you how much of your environment lines up with intent or people that you meet or experiences that you have. So this is a really fun one. In the compass class taught by Tamara McGillivray, this is one of the most amazing things you can do is you can bring that local space compass directly onto a floor plan. And this is one of the things I learned directly from her. And I utilize it all the time for myself, for friends, for clients. Actually, anyone who will listen to me talk about it, I will talk about it. There's so many interesting things going on in this map. But I'll try to be brief and just highlight the few that I think are really stand out. And the first is that Mercury, Neptune, Venus lines running directly through her bedroom. And this is accounted for directionality. It's laid out on the floor plan in the direction, the cardinal directions. So we have this repeating Neptune, Venus, Mercury opposition is what's showing here on these lines. And she kind of, follows this Neptunian idyllic idea, right? I'm going to travel to Italy and have this, whatever experience, this idyllic idea in her head. And it followed her right into her home. You can also see that sun line, which I previously showed, flows right into her bedroom as well. Meredith, her bedroom lies right on that Saturn moon. Like we've already discussed, that Saturn line runs right through London, and then we'll talk about the destiny point that also activates that Saturn line. And the one last thing that I thought was pretty interesting was even something as trivial as like a smashed window ends up on her Mars line. I think that's just like fascinating. You have that like glass and cutting and the violence of smashing in a window associated with that Mars. And it's an incoming line. So someone broke in through that window into her room. So this is where things get really interesting. And it's just another great way to look at charts and angles. The geospatial aspects are the aspects between the planets from what would be like her perspective, right? So there's a natal horizon perspective, and then there's the relocated perspective. And I think it's very important to notice what changes in these charts. Because I am drilling down into that Neptune, Mercury, Venus situation, I think that one of the things that's important for this is that she has a very nodal chart. And in fact, the nodes square those lines. When we relocate to Italy, it puts those nodes on the horizon, meaning she has to deal with the fate of those lines. She has to bring her attention to and deal with the fated aspects of what happened to her in Italy. She also has the Pluto, Jupiter, Mars, T-square in her chart that disappears when she moves to Italy. So some of that drive to move from her location, her home location, that T-square is what drives her out of that place and into Italy. And then she picks up this beautiful Jupiter, Uranus, Sun trine. She also picked up a square between Pluto and Mercury. This little bit about like power struggles, controlling her narrative. Spatial aspects are just like another way to really kind of see what changes between locations, what gets activated, what you might not see in the chart. You can start to look at things like the Jupiter-Pluto opposition is completely gone in Italy. But then it picks up another contact with a different planet activating that. So now we're going to pull it back around to the crossings. And here, this crossing, I am talking about her local space crossing her ACG lines in Italy. So this is both from the natal chart. So destiny points, and this is something that Cindy talks about a lot, and it's just like great information. It really shows you where powerful spots are. They're pretty potent, as her story shows, for sure. So the first one that I wanted to look at was this Venus line crossing that Saturn ISC. And like has already been discussed, that Saturn ISC has caused her some problems. It's right outside of London, very close. It's less than a degree away. So this is a very potent spot that is then kind of telegraphed down to her in Italy. And you could say a lot of things about this, but in my mind, it has a lot to do with how she was, first of all, Nick Pisa helping the inspector essentially demonize her as some like sex-crazed, drug-addled person, right? Like you have this Venus-Saturn situation going on, really involved heavily in the way that she was talked about in the media. And the fact that Meredith is right from basically this place, right? We have one more. This destiny point, I do believe, is probably, like the key to her finally getting free. As mentioned before, her Chiron midheaven line there, it was really like her being wounded on the public stage, but her also gaining healing on the public stage is kind of indicated here. Her local space Neptune line crosses her Chiron ACG line, and this is very close to Florence. So if you remember, she went through all of that in Perugia. The courts there were back and forth, convicting, not convicting. It was when the trial finally went to Florence that she was exonerated. And she was exonerated, and I kind of called this, because it's so close to this destiny point, I kind of labeled this like the karmic closure and spiritual justice, right? She finally had her public identity as a wounded healer was highlighted here, but in a positive way for her. The Florence courts were able to cut through the fog of all of that Neptunian stuff happening in Perugia. And then there was healing for her on the world stage too. And what I didn't put on this slide, but I can mention here because hopefully y'all remember that her sun local space line from Perugia actually runs exactly through Florence. So that's another thing. She was able to eventually shine through, and that sun line brought her to justice also in Florence. Just another great tool. Hopefully I was able to elucidate some of the ways that it influenced her story in Italy.
Thank you, Shae. Excellent, excellent job, especially of what so many mysteries of the local space that you've been showing us. So there you are talking about the destiny points. And if we could get back to the slide on the geospatial aspects, what Shae has pointed out with the local space is here we have yet another coordinate system in astromapping, a third coordinate system, the horizontal coordinate system. So we go over the ecliptic, the equatorial, and now the horizontal. And she mentioned that when she was talking about the nodes on the horizon. Astrocartography is often seen as our relationship with the world, and local space may be miscategorized as the immediate environment. Yet Shae, as holistic as she is, showed us how dynamic the local space lines are. Local space lines are you-centered. You're the center of your universe. Your geotag from 3 different coordinate systems forge who you are in the immediate space. And like Shae kept on mentioning and reminding us, because we should be reminded of it with the natal chart, wherever you go, you take yourself with you. What you are geotag with at your place of birth is going to be part of the tendency and the patterns of your life. Shae showed us how local space can show you it's not just the ACG, planets on angles, but how the perspective of the sky at the place that you're born can affect your experiences in the new places that you go and how you adjust to it or not. The geospatial local space aspects point out that it is the missing ingredient in local space analysis. It's not just lines again, it's taking everything and putting it together, as Shae had showed us. She explained much more than just a relocated natal chart. But here we go, the relocated geospatial aspects of the horizontal system. And in considering the natal and relocated geospatial aspects, we could see how Amanda's reaction manifests. The other thing that Shae also pointed out so nicely is a bit of remote activation there. And she talks about how it's a destiny point. And I love the way that you put it, Shae. It was telegrammed down to her as back down to Italy. And that was Venus, her as a female, carrying that energy of that Saturn, that death, that, kind of being buried. I mean, literally as a female being imprisoned. And, how tormenting it was on a Chiron line and kind of getting lost in that Neptunian fog. What torment. And this journalist, Nick Pisa, really delivered a lot of that torment to her. You also pointed out how her Mercury manifested in the local space and her working not as a formal job, but what she did in the prison, translating for other people. Thank you so much, Shae. I really loved how you are shedding a light as a Scorpio. You don't really associate light or sunshine or brightness, right, with Scorpio, but it talks about the depth that you brought and that whole level of analysis with your seeing it outside the box with your moon in Aquarius. And it's just that practical application with that Capricorn approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy.
I was a kid. What I was pretending, I needed my mom. Amanda realized this about herself when she landed in Italy and found herself in a situation no one would ever imagine or ever willingly want to walk into. And now we move on to Lori Barnes's presentation. She is a professional astrologer, a licensed psychotherapist, a marketing strategist with over 35 years of experience across the industry. She specializes in timing, location, and decision-making for small business owners and heart-centered professionals, blending modern and traditional astrology with her background in psychology and marketing. She has a master's in both psychology and marketing. Based between Illinois, USA, and Rome, Italy, Lori is known for her work in business strategy and coaching. Currently, she serves as the marketing director for OPA, the Organization of Professional Astrologers, and for Kepler College, where she also teaches courses on astrology and branding. Lori is also a friend, and I could say that seeing her as a peer and as a student, she devoured the information in a way that only a Libra would. Information gathering, digesting, analyzing it, and then applying it. Lori, we appreciate everything that you do, not just for Kepler College, but in the world of astrology as a teacher, a fellow student, and a professional level astromapper. Lori, please jump into your presentation.
Thank you, Cindy. Very kind, very kind. I do love working for Kepler College. And I have the pleasure of wrapping up our presentation today following amazing presentations. So I get to change gears a little bit and talk a bit more about the mythology or the archetypes, the psychology behind these placements. And I'm going to focus on Chiron, Vesta, Ceres, and Uranus in this presentation. And you're familiar with that because it's already been covered by my peers, my colleagues, exceptional presentations. So now you are familiar with Amanda's chart. So you have seen this before. I'm showing it again because I was really fascinated by the flip of the ascendant-descendant axis to the midheaven IC axis. So she goes from one axis to another. And I think that we have heard in studies in different classes with different teachers and different astrologers, you know, we know how important the angles are. We know how hot they are. You know, I love Cindy's analysis or metaphor that the angles are the plug and then the planets, they get plugged into that socket and then, you know, they get that extra kind of like attention in the chart. And we see that show up time and time again. If you see clients, you know that when planets are angular, they show up. When they're not angular, they can be more internal. And the reason why I'm talking about this and why I think it's important is because sometimes those angles, and when the planets are congested around those angles, the taking on of the collective. And of course, when we see celebrity charts, that's when it really comes out, when we can see the planet on an angle and it's just, you know, in our face because they're celebrities. So we get to know more about their lives, at least their public lives, than we do the person who's not famous. We know more about our clients because they're walking in the door and they're talking to us and they're telling us about their lives. As Meg said, we didn't get a chance to talk to Amanda, although I think we all would love to, and have Amanda come do another video with us and share details. But since we weren't able to do that, we're sticking with what we found publicly, and there was a lot of publicity around this. So I'm going to focus on this change from the 1-7 to the 10-4, and I'm going to start talking more about the mythology and the archetypes. So we've already seen a lot of that from the other presentations. I'm just showing it once again and showing you some of the orbs. We see that in Perugia, the lines that were the closest for Amanda are the same lines that were in her natal chart. So not her natal map. There's a big difference, right? The map's got the lines and the chart is the circle with the planets. So in her natal chart, she had the 1-7, and she had Chiron and Vesta in the first house and Uranus, Ceres in the 7th house. They weren't angular, they weren't exactly on the angle, but they were in the same sign, and they would be considered angular in traditional astrology. And in the whole sign house system, they would be in the same house. So now we're looking at Perugia, and it flips, and we see that the Chiron Vesta line is there here at the top, and the Uranus Ceres line is there at the bottom. And those are the four that are most prominent in astrocartography for Amanda Knox in Perugia, in Italy. So here we are talking about some of the archetypes that have come up. When I was working on this, it became very clear that this is a hero's journey. If you've ever studied any of the writing, like for Star Wars, I'm a big Star Wars fan, and it's pretty well known that George Lucas consulted Joseph Campbell, and the Luke Skywalker character and really all of Star Wars was based on the hero's journey. And we have Amanda, who went on her hero's journey. She left home as a maiden. She left home as innocent. We could say a child, even though she was 18 years old. She was called to the adventure, and that's how the hero's journey starts. There's that call to the adventure. Usually that call is, like, I can't do it. I don't want to go. But in Amanda's case, she really wanted to go. And of course, that's explained with that Uranus, this Sagittarius moon. I think she has plenty in her chart that would indicate that she would want to go off on an adventure. And then she goes and she's in Perugia, and she has the ordeal, right? The hero always has their ordeal to face. And she is imprisoned. She's convicted twice. She's taken to the underworld. And I don't want to go too far into that just yet, because there's that mythology that's very clearly at play. And then there's the return. In the hero's journey, there's the return home. And she's a changed person. This is from her own words. We could see her story, and we could all see that she's changed. And she definitely says that she was changed. And that Chiron is so prominent in her chart that she is, I believe, really taking on that collective idea of a wounded healer. She's doing it publicly. We all have Chiron somewhere in our chart. We all have a wounding, and we could all be wounded healers in some way or another, depending on how well we work with it in our own chart. But in Amanda's, we see her become the collective wounded healer. For those in her public arena, those who know of her, who follow her, who have been helped by her, they know her as the wounded healer. She's literally taking on that collective role and showing us what a wounded healer looks like. Of course, in Perugia is when the midheaven and the IC are highlighted, and then at home, it's the AC descendant, which we've already talked about, and I'm going to move on. So I want to talk about some of the archetypes. I'm going to start with Chiron, which seems to be the main archetype that we see. Now, that may not be true in her personal life. We don't know her. She's a mother, she's a wife, she's a daughter. She lives in a community that is familiar to her. She went back to Seattle. So there may be lots of other archetypes that she plays out, but Chiron is really prominent in terms of her public life. Some of the archetypes that we could say go with Chiron: the outsider. And I know that other presentations today referred to her as the outsider. And the teacher. She is a teacher. Some of the myths associated with Chiron. Chiron as a baby was rejected by his mother. And he, of course, was the half man, half centaur, right? There was the merging of the god Zeus, who turned into a mare. And that was when the seed was planted with a human mom. So he comes out as half human, half centaur. His mother was horrified and, said, I don't want anything to do with you. Now, I'm paraphrasing this myth, and I will say that I'm taking my material from Demetra George and Ariel Gutman. Each of them has a book that talks about myth, and I highly recommend you read that because it's very good material. And I just want to give a shout out to them for the pioneering work that they've done with myth and the planets in astrology. Okay, so Chiron, he grows up. He was a teacher of legendary figures in Greek myth, and he is half immortal, so he doesn't die. Then he gets shot by Hercules, when there was some centaur action going on at a party and there were fights and Hercules was shooting his poison arrow. And of course, Chiron wasn't even part of that. He was off studying in his den and he hears the commotion and he comes out and he gets accidentally hit by one of those arrows. It's poisonous and he has to live with immense pain that never goes away and he can't die. So this is the wounding. This is a part of Chiron's story of how he became the wounded healer. And of course, his famous story is that he ultimately gave up his immortality so that he could die and be pain-free. And it's part of the Prometheus story. Prometheus stole the fire, gave the fire to the humans, and then was sentenced to be chained to a rock and have his liver pecked out every day by the birds, only for it to come back and go through it again. So Chiron sacrificed himself to help Prometheus, and he was able to take away his pain. So I hope that you see how Amanda's story and Chiron that is so prominent in her chart. So why is this important, right? You might be going, well, why is she talking about this? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because when we have clients, it's not always so easy to just talk about the wound or the difficulties that a person can experience. And by bringing in myth, by bringing in metaphors, by bringing in archetypes, it's a way to open the door to a subject that can be more comforting or easier for your client to talk about the experience without having to go through explanation of difficulty that they've had. And sometimes just by talking about the planet or the asteroid in this case, you can tell the story and then they may open up to you about their own story. The next story is Vesta, and I think Vesta is really important. And of course, when you hear about Vesta, you probably hear about the Vestal Virgins, and you hear about all of the mythology that has to do with Vesta and the Vestal Virgins since Christianity began. But what I discovered, and again, thank you, Demetra, thank you, Ariel, that there is a other mythology about Vesta before Christianity changed it and before sacred women were actually chaste. They weren't before. In fact, they were so sacred that they had the pagan rites and they often bore the children of men, and it was without knowing who they were with. You know, we could talk hours on this mythology and we don't have that much time. So I encourage you to read about that. But why is it important? Well, because she became this exotic sexual beast, the deviant, and all of these kind of terrible things that were put on women. I think of this myth and I'm thinking, well, that happened to her too. You know, she was pure before, she was innocent, she was young, and then she went through this ordeal and kind of comes out on the other side with this reputation put on her, not of her own doing, but the media, the press, the police. I think that this happened to this goddess Vesta in our mythology. And if you look back, you see like there's clearly this Vesta before and then a Vesta after Christianity. And so much was changed and who these women were. They were sacred, powerful beings that it was taken away. They still had some power as a Vestal Virgin, but definitely not the kind of power they had before. I think that that's a really cool configuration in Amanda's chart to kind of get underneath the story and look at it as a mythology playing out in front of our eyes. And I'm going to talk more about the archetypes because I think that makes more sense with Uranus. Another outsider, a double here, if we're saying that Chiron was an outsider and Uranus is an outsider, and they went from her ascendant descendant angles to her midheaven icy. I would imagine that Uranus was very present and being different, knowing that she was different. She said that, I'm quirky. She's all these Uranus words, but we were talking to them in Seattle on the first house, seventh house. Well, now in Italy, it's the 10th house. And wow, did that kind of like blow up and erupt out there for all of us to see. So I think that Uranus archetype, the disruptor, probably didn't go there wanting to be the disruptor, but she was used, the media, as this person who disrupted somebody's life So the rebel is another one that, of course, we know Uranus is the rebel. And then we have Ceres. Ceres is Demeter in Greek. And of course, you probably know about that mythology, that Demeter was the mom, Persephone was the daughter. The daughter is out in the field, the earth opens, Hades comes up, takes Persephone, and he takes her down into the underworld with the intention of making her his wife. Demeter, or Ceres, is the goddess of agriculture. Without her, the land doesn't produce and people can't eat. And of course, it became a problem when the food wasn't producing, and Zeus finally intervened and helped Demeter get her daughter back, but only for a part of the year. This is another one that it's just like, wow, Amanda is really personifying this myth. We're seeing it play out. She gets taken away to the underworld. I think someone even referred to that earlier when they were talking about going into jail. She was separated from her mother, and she wanted her mother. She needed her family. You know, who was I kidding? I needed my mom. That's a quote. You'll see it in the documentary if you watch it. Here we are with one more myth playing out for the whole world, kind of taking on that collective mythology and showing us what that looks like. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today. I think my peers covered the astrocartography and the local space and geodetics so well that I wanted to talk about the chart in a bit of a different way. And it has inspired me. I'm actually writing a class that brings this mythology and the archetypes together with the planets. And it's really fun. So stay tuned for that. Back to you, Cindy.
Thank you for showing the viewers and aspiring astromappers how we could use asteroids in astromapping analysis. I really loved when you talked about Uranus as the disruptor and how much she brings disruption to the table in ways she's activating that Uranus IC, right? To bring justice to victims of malign systems. And how you take the asteroids and really layer that in to what all of the presentations here have said, and just so poignantly using the psychology of it. Like, you brought your own specialty and showed us how it doesn't have to necessarily follow the square format, but the talents that we all bring. And my, oh my, you've definitely shown how talented you are, especially with applying the psychology into the astromapping. And what are astrological readings, right? But I think many of them are a form of therapy in some ways. So
yeah. And you know, there's one thing I forgot to mention, and this is something that I learned from you, Cindy, that I think is really important for our listeners if you're studying astrocartography or any astromapping, and that is that the angle, whether it's the MC, IC, AC, DC, that's the entry point, but eventually that energy can go to the different part, you know, the MC, IC.
Yes, when we're doing astrocartography analysis and we look at the maps, we look at the planet. That's the energy that's going to manifest. And then we look at the angle, because that's the door that the energy is going to come through. And when it comes through there, it affects absolutely everything else in our lives. Nick Pisa, we've mentioned his name a couple of times. If you see the documentary that was out on Netflix, and we'll put that link down in the description, you guys are going to make your own opinions of him. I am 100% sure it's going to be aligned with what everybody on this panel is thinking, but we're just not going to say because our mama's raised us to be nice. I see where he was coming from. At the end, you could see, for instance, how when Meg and Shae were pointing out the energy in England, how that really manifested for her. He said, but hey, what are we supposed to do? We're journalists and we're reporting what we are being told. It's not as if I could say, hold on a minute, I just want to double check that myself in some way. Who knows how? And I'll let my rival get there first before me. And then, hey, I've lost the scoop. It doesn't work like that. Not in a news game. I mean, I get it, but we don't do that at Kepler College. I think that's probably one of the things that kind of rubbed the wrong way against all of us. But ladies, would you like to chime in and talk about what you think about it?
I would just say I think it's ridiculous that he's claiming to be a reporter and then having no way of finding out whether or not something is true. Like, it's absurd. It's almost comedy at that point.
Yeah, it's like pass the buck. Oh, it's not my fault.
Yeah.
That's how I read it. But, I will give it to him that he was honest.
But he relished in it. That was part of the problem. He was like, ha ha ha, look at, I got this information. And he kind of talked about like how it made him in his career. But I don't know, or I don't, if he realizes, or even if he cares, like just the impression that he leaves with the kind of person he was to do that to someone else.
What really bothered me the most was that he was the one that got the diary. He was the one that chose to make that public. And they never say, I don't think they know how he got it. But, you read into it. Did he pay for it? Did he collude with someone to get it? Did he collude with a guard? Like it didn't just magically walk out of her cell and into his hands. I think that that's a real shame, but I think that that is also journalism. And, maybe there's a deeper question as to how does the journalism industry get there?
Integrity, right? In his case, lack of it. And even looking at the quote unquote justice system, it's like you said, how did he get this from the jail system? Obviously, it's tied into someone that was very crooked. Meg, Brandi, Beth, what are your thoughts about like this whole thing overall? Any part of it, not just Nick, but Amanda's story.
I was going to say, are we going to look at his chart next? Maybe we should. Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating how it all played out, and the different layers that we've all added to this story has just kind of made me even more of like in awe of astromapping and the technique that we've learned through Kepler. I do think I just go back to the fact that she was, a teenager going on an experience of a lifetime and just came back with so much more than what she ever would have imagined. And it takes a certain type of person to be able to go through that and come out the other side with the level of resilience and power and empowerment that she's turned that around. Yeah, I just kind of was really inspired by her and her story.
Just the fact that she could go out there with everything that she's learned and everything she's experienced and be such a voice in the world for wrongly accused, for women, for everything that she's doing out there and just owning it. You really, really have to admire her strength.
Brandi, you looked a lot at her natal chart in this presentation. Would you like to talk about how Pluto and Moon, which generally most astrologers would say, wow, that's a rather tumultuous type of combination, and how that actually manifested with her in transcendence, especially of a situation like that?
It's really inspiring because for me, like looking at the Placidus that was happening in her 12th house, and she's got Jupiter there. So with everything that she went through in Italy and how awful that must have been for her, she was still able to like come home and really use that energy, use that experience and everything that she went to do something with it that was going to be impactful for the greater good and for society, not just for herself. And it really just reminds me that every astrological energy is useful for something. Like even if it's awful today, like what can you do with it tomorrow?
And Shae, you really showed us the patterns. And we say astrology is patterns and it's cycles. And look at how you kept on showing how that local space played out in the world, to Italy, and down to the room and the neighborhood that she stayed in. You want to talk a bit more about like how people have our patterns? And, here she was trying to explore the world, yet in the meantime, she's actually following a pattern unknowingly. What would you say about that?
Yeah, that's why I find local space, a sub of a sub in the astrology and especially astromapping is so fascinating because a lot of it is unconscious, right? If we're aware of it, however, then you can bring in stuff like remediation. Like that's kind of like when I was going through it, thinking like, well, if she was my client, like, how would I remediate this? Like, what could you bring to the table to help people deal with these energies? Or like, where are places to avoid? Or don't maybe travel on that line. I don't know. Would I have told her maybe don't get that house with those girls? I mean, it's just like a fascinating sort of thing you could think about.
One of the things that Amanda said, I really felt after living so long in a tragedy in Italy, what I wanted to have was good memories alongside them. So I wouldn't have this distorted view of this ultimately beautiful country and beautiful people. That was really important to me, to see Italy for what it really was and not just the seat of the worst experience in my life. You know, I think this brings it back down to the natal chart, in my opinion, because if we look at the astrocartography map, we could see that powerful Pluto and moon position there. Really, what she wanted to do was not exactly forget it. She can't forget it. She shouldn't forget it. This is part of her story, but to forgive, to live without it on the weight of her soul, on the weight of her life, and to define her and to turn her into that tragedy. You know, one of the things that she did is she was really, really trying to talk to that police chief or police captain. I apologize if I didn't get his title right, but the one that really wanted to just make sure she goes to jail and was insistent and very stubborn. She once talked about him, might have been on live TV, and she was saying about she forgave him. She understood that he believed what he thought was true and went after it. And, you know, he watched that and he was so touched and so moved that he finally reached out to her and talked to her. And it was melted away. Thank goodness. I'm really happy that when she went back to America, that she got to do her healing, that her magnificent family that, I mean, they remortgaged their homes. They almost essentially went bankrupt. I'm sure they probably went into debt. She talks about the financials of what was going on, but how much they stood behind her, and both her parents came together, her step parents. I mean, everybody was working together in order to take care of Amanda. And as she put it, that it wasn't just her life that changed, their lives have changed too. And how her sisters even put their lives on hold just to make sure that they're standing behind her. She goes back, and what does she do as a Cancer through all this healing and all this transcendence? Good for her. She gets married and she has kids herself. I'm sure that is going to impress her own children. It's already impressed us. I mean, we travel and we hear this story, especially as women, of like, oh my God, like this is an awful, like to be in a prison in a foreign country. What I would love to say too is about all of your presentations. Wow, wow, and wow. One of the rewards of having known Meg, Brandi, Beth, Shae, and Lordy from the beginning with AM 100 AstroMapping for Beginners, and to see him again in AM 300, the AstroMapping Practicum, and yet again in the space after completing their AstroMapping certificate requirements, many of them returning for AstroMapping classes. They weren't obliged to do so. I mean, I've seen them in different classes, such as the astronomy of the astromapping, the geodetics, the local space remediation, asteroids and astromapping. And I have seen that some of you have already are going to be signing up for movement in astromapping coming up soon. But they go beyond that. I've seen how they practice, how they apply, how they continue to sharpen their precision, nailing it with the astromapping again. Wow. To those of you who are interested in astromapping, you too could dive as deep as you'd like and at your pace with Kepler College AstroMapping program. I love to boast that we are the premier and most comprehensive astromapping program in the world. Woot woot! Deserve the woot woot. We're not stopping there. We're continuing to grow and expand the certification. And at Kepler College, you don't just learn the astromapping. There's other kinds of astrology that you could learn there, the foundational, the transits, the movements. And why do we do this? Why did all the ladies that you see here do this? Passion, love. And if you've seen, they've cited their sources because they are true scholars of astromapping. And I remember they all started off as like kind of shy, kind of like timid about the information, and look at the powerhouses they are now. Most of all, they want to deliver the right information to you since traveling, and especially relocating, is not something we want to be casual with, and not with our clients. We don't want to send somebody to the wrong place and then tell them like, oh, don't worry, it's your Venus line. It's going to be so peachy and flowery. No, but give them more of an in-depth analysis. You are going to learn this too, maybe for yourself, maybe for your own clients. Join us in your journey with learning astromapping. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.